When I first turned the key to Uncle Jeremiah's cabin, I expected dust, silence, and the scent of old pine and forgotten years. Instead, the door creaked open to the faint aroma of baking bread and 5 sets of eyes staring back at me. The woman in the center stepped forward with a confidence I couldn't place, not arrogance, just like she belonged here. She was tall, striking, with ash blonde hair pinned up in a braid that looked both practical and elegant. Her voice was calm, yet amused. "You can handle all 5 of us," she said. I froze in the doorway, half expecting I'd walked into the wrong cabin. "I'm sorry, this is my place. Belonged to my uncle, Jeremiah Reeves." "That it did," she nodded, "but he left more than just land behind." Behind her stood 4 other women, each with their own air. A redhead with calloused hands, a dark-eyed woman with a gardener's tan, one with soft, observant eyes and a book clutched to her chest, and another who wore boots caked with dry mud and a wide-brimmed hat like she just returned from a ride. "You must be Clayton," the blonde said, stepping aside. "Come in." I didn't move at first. I felt like I'd stumbled into a dream someone forgot to wake me up from. This was supposed to be a quiet escape, a piece of land in the hills, far from anyone and anything. I hadn't seen my uncle in years, but when the deed showed up in the mail and the lawyer told me it was mine, free and clear, I packed my bags without a second thought. Inside, the cabin was completely transformed. What I remembered as a one-room shack was now a living space with structure and warmth. Tables, shelves, curtains, even rugs. Somehow, it still smelled like Uncle Jeremiah, though. Pipe smoke and leather. I stood awkwardly by the door until one of the women, the redhead, handed me a tin cup of coffee. "You look like you need this more than we do." The blonde, Clarabelle, I learned, guided me to a chair. "We should talk." So I listened. Their names came in a rhythm I wouldn't forget. Clarabelle, Grace, Ruby, Violet, and Sadie. They said they'd known my uncle for years, that he'd taken them in one by one, gave them shelter, protection, and a place to start over. "He called us his nieces," Violet said softly. "Said family isn't always blood." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to wrap my head around it. I hadn't spoken to Uncle Jeremiah since I was 16. He was the black sheep of the family, a man with strong hands and a quiet mind who disappeared into the hills after Mama's funeral. Now he was dead, and apparently he hadn't lived the hermit life I imagined. Clarabelle set down a thick folder on the table between us. We knew this day would come. Jeremiah said if anyone showed up claiming the place, we should offer our truth before war. I opened the folder. Photos, letters, receipts, names, dates. They weren't squatters. This wasn't some wild coincidence. They had a story, and from the look in their eyes, they were ready to defend it. Still, I owned the deed. I had come for peace, maybe to grieve a little. What I got instead was 5 women staring at me like they already knew something I didn't. I said the only thing I could think to say, "Well, I guess I'll hear you out." They exchanged glances, and for the first time Clarabelle smiled, not wide, but real. "We hoped you'd say that." The women moved through the cabin like it had always been theirs. Ruby tossed another log onto the fire. Sadie adjusted the kettle without looking, and Grace, who had the careful eyes of someone who knew numbers better than people, placed a stack of papers in front of me. "This is our contract," she said simply. I raised an eyebrow, still holding the folder from earlier. "Contract with who?" "Jeremiah," Grace replied. "Legally notarized, dated 6 years ago." I thumbed through it, expecting something sloppy, a scribbled note or a favor-bound promise. Instead, it was meticulous, a formal agreement. Jeremiah granted full residence, access, and co-ownership of the cabin and adjoining land to all 5 women for the rest of their natural lives. My name wasn't in it, not once. "But I have the deed," I muttered. "You do," Clarabelle nodded, "but he wanted us protected, said you might come someday and we should show you everything, show you why." I kept flipping pages, my heart beating faster. It didn't make sense. Jeremiah hadn't spoken to me in 15 years, yet he'd left me the land. Why wouldn't he mention the women? Why hide all of this? "Was he sick?" I asked quietly. "Did any of you know?" Sadie shook her head, just slower. Quit riding. Stayed near the porch. Last time I saw him, he was smiling at the sunrise, like he'd already said goodbye. The room fell silent. Outside, wind rustled through the trees. I felt like I was trespassing in a life I never knew existed. Ruby leaned forward. "We're not here to steal your inheritance, Clayton. We built this place, with our hands, with him. Every nail, every fence post. We didn't come here for comfort. We came here for survival." I met her eyes. There was a hardness there, but underneath, something tender, wounded. "What brought you here?" I asked. She hesitated. "A man who didn't like hearing no. Jeremiah helped me disappear." Grace added, "I ran from debt collectors my husband left behind. He forged my signature and vanished. I was weeks from prison when Jeremiah took me in." Sadie didn't say nothing, just looked out the window like her past was still chasing her. Violet, the youngest, offered a faint smile. "I grew up in this area. Parents died. I had no one. He fed me, taught me how to make rope and how to plant turnips." "And Clarabelle?" I asked. She was watching me closely, arms folded. "I ran a ranch with my brother in Texas until he sold it out from under me and tried to trade me to a neighbor with Cohen. That one hit me in the gut." I leaned back in the chair, staring at the walls Jeremiah must have built. The shelves stocked with jars labeled in neat handwriting. None of it matched the man I remembered. He was gruff, solitary, but these women spoke of him like a father. "You said he called you nieces." Clarabelle nodded. "He said blood can betray you, but chosen family, they earn their place." I rubbed my temples, overwhelmed. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Maybe he thought you wouldn't understand," Grace said softly. The truth was, I wasn't sure I did. But looking around at these women, how they moved, how they looked at one another, it was clear they weren't guests. They were roots in this place. Jeremiah hadn't just given them shelter. He'd trusted them with his legacy. And now, somehow, I was part of it. I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no, but I closed the folder and said, "I'll stay a few days. Hear the rest." Clarabelle smiled again. "That's all we ask." I barely had time to settle into the guest cot that first night before the tension shifted in the air. Something about the way the women moved the next morning told me they sensed a storm coming. Grace locked the shed without explanation. Ruby saddled her mare before breakfast. Sadie kept checking the tree line like the wind was whispering secrets to her. Around noon, we heard hooves. Not just one rider, but a group, maybe 6 or 7 men, moving slow but steady, kicking up dust like they owned the trail. Clarabelle stood on the porch, arms crossed. Her body was still, but her eyes were on fire. "Who is it?" I asked, joining her. She didn't answer right away. Then, in a tone that made my stomach clench,
she said, "Morrison." The name meant nothing to me, but judging by the sudden shift in energy inside the cabin, it meant a hell of a lot to them. I stepped off the porch, hand instinctively brushing the side of my coat, even though I didn't carry a weapon. What does he want? To take back what he thinks he owns, she said bitterly. The rotters emerged through the trees, 7 of them, with Morrison at the center. He wore a long duster and a brimmed hat pulled low, but I could still see his grin from 20 yards off. It was the kind of smile you'd see on a wolf circling a lamb that limped. "Well, well," he called out as he dismounted. "Thought I smelled lavender and mutiny." Clarabelle didn't flinch. "Turn around, Morrison. You've got no place here." His eyes slid to me. "And who's the hired help?" "I'm Clayton Reeves. This is my land." He chuckled and pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Not according to these." I glanced down. More contracts. He claimed Clarabelle, Ruby, and Sadi were legally bound to work for him. The dates were suspicious, the signatures sloppier than a drunk preacher's. "They're forged," Grace said flatly, stepping beside me. Morrison shrugged. "Proof's in the paper, sweetheart. Sheriff don't ask too many questions when I show him ink and a signature." "You forged those papers, just like you forged your marriage license and your ranch ledger and everything else you needed to climb the ladder." "I built that ladder. On the backs of women," she shot back. His calm cracked then, just for a second. His voice went low and sharp. "You left me, Clarabelle. You and the others took what wasn't yours." "They weren't yours either," she said. I stepped between them without thinking. "You're not taking anyone. You've got no legal ground, and you're trespassing." He smiled again, slower this time. "You draw a lot of conclusions for someone who just arrived." "I've seen enough." He looked around at the other women now, the kind of gaze that strips dignity from bone. "You think hiding up here changes anything? You can scrub pots and plant vegetables, but you'll always owe me." "You've got one chance to leave. Next time, we're not talking." That got a laugh from his men, but Morrison didn't laugh. He just held my stare, searching for weakness. Finally, he tipped his hat, but not out of respect. "You picked your side, boy. Hope you know what that means." They rode off slow, like they owned the road. The women didn't move until the dust settled. "Why'd you do that?" Clarabelle asked. "Because he looked at you like property, and I don't stand for that." There was a long silence, broken only by the creak of the porch railing under her grip. "You might have just started a war," she whispered. I nodded. "Then I'm in it with you."
That night, the cabin didn't feel like a home. It felt like a fortress. Ruby sharpened her knives at the kitchen table. Grace sat near the fire, sorting through a box of documents. Violet lit candles at every window, while Sadie moved silently, loading a rifle she kept hidden in a hollow floorboard. Clarabelle sat across from me, nursing a chipped mug of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I think it's time we tell you everything," she said. I nodded. "I'm listening." She started with Morrison, how he'd built his ranch from nothing, using charm and fake promises to lure desperate women into his orbit. How he'd offered them safety, then debt, then chains. Not literal ones, contracts, credit, and the kind of threats that don't leave bruises, just silence. "He married my sister first, Margaret. He said he loved her, then he took everything from her." I stiffened. "You told me Margaret was dead." "She's not," Grace cut in. "She faked it, with our help." Ruby added, We buried a coffin full of stones. Morrison thinks he put her in the ground. That's how she disappeared." My heart thudded. "Where is she now?" Clarabelle pulled out a small worn locket from beneath her shirt and opened it. Inside was a faded sketch of a woman with dark curls and hollow cheeks. "She's safe, for now, but she's willing to come forward if it'll end this." "She'll testify?" I asked. Sadie nodded. "We've already sent word to the territorial marshal." That caught my breath. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice, about turning the tables on a man who had hunted them all. Grace laid out the documents across the table. Forged contracts, letters signed under duress, even statements from other women who'd escaped Morrison's reach. Some pages were tear-stained, others bore notary stamps that had long since been discredited. I picked up a faded sheet with Margaret's name on it. "This says she signed over all rights to his ranch?" "She didn't," Clarabelle said. "He threatened to kill her if she didn't. She left that night and never looked back." Everything clicked into place. This wasn't more than a land dispute. This was a reckoning. I looked at each of them in turn. Violet, who barely spoke but never stopped watching. Sadie, whose quiet nature masked something razor sharp. Grace, who held her chin high even when her hands trembled. Ruby, fierce and loyal. And Clarabelle, who carried the weight of all of them without complaint. "He's coming back, and he won't ride in polite next time." "No," Clarabelle said, her voice like gravel. "He'll come to finish what he started." There was a knock at the door. Everyone froze. I reached for the rifle Ruby had given me earlier. But it wasn't Morrison. It was a man in a black coat with a U.S. Marshal badge pinned to his lapel. "Name's Abram Keller. Got a message to meet a woman named Clarabelle. Said it's time we talk about a man named Morrison." Inside, Clarabelle offered him coffee while Grace handed over the documents. As the marshal pored over the pages, he whistled low. "Looks like you've built yourself a fine case, but it won't be enough unless someone's willing to speak." "They are," I said. "All of them." The marshal looked up. "And you?" I swallowed. "I inherited this land 2 days ago, but I didn't just inherit a cabin, I inherited a cause." He smiled slightly, then folded the papers. "We'll need a plan, because when men like Morrison feel the walls closing in, they shoot first and lie later." That night, we made a plan. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just visiting someone else's life. I was in it, all the way. Dawn came slow, thick with the kind of stillness that only shows up before something breaks. Clarabelle stood on the porch with the marshal, scanning the tree line. I hadn't slept. None of us had. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a warning. The plan was simple. Wait for Morrison to return, let him show his cards, then confront him with the marshal present, evidence, witness, and law in hand. But men like Morrison don't follow scripts. We saw the dust trail before we heard the horses. 8 riders this time, not 7. Morrison had brought reinforcements. He rode up bold, grinning like a showman. "Back again," he called, dismounting. "You all playing house with government company now?" Marshal Keller stepped forward, calm and direct. "James Morrison, I have testimony, statements, and sufficient evidence to bring you in for contract fraud, conspiracy, and attempted coercion. You're under arrest." Morrison's smile didn't fade, It twisted. You think I'm gonna let some badge tell me where I go on land I built? It's not your land, I said, stepping beside Clarabelle. Morrison's hand dropped toward his hip. Clarabelle moved, but too slow. He was already drawing. Time didn't slow down. It sped up. Too fast to think, too fast to shout. But my uncle's old revolver, the one Grace had quietly placed in my hands earlier, was already there. Heavy, polished, loaded. I didn't aim. I reacted. The gunshot split the air, loud and final. Morrison's revolver flew from his hand, knocked clean by the bullet. His wrist twisted violently, and he screamed, dropping to his knees. Before his men could even move, the marshal raised his rifle. Next move gets you buried. None of them tested him. They froze, caught between loyalty and fear. Morrison was whimpering, clutching his wrist, spitting curses into the dirt. Clarabelle didn't gloat. She just walked up and looked him square in the eye. You always said I was weak. You were wrong. The marshal cuffed him, reading his rights, while Ruby and Sadie took the rifles from his men. One by one, they surrendered. I stood there, shaking from the adrenaline. My ears rang from the shot, and my hands still gripped the revolver too tight. Clarabelle turned to me. You all right? I think so. You didn't hesitate. I saw his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. She stepped closer. You just saved my life. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. You saved yourselves. I just caught up. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Not just the man who arrived with a deed, but someone who'd chosen a side and meant it. The marshal loaded Morrison into a wagon while his men were disarmed and bound for questioning. The legal fight wasn't over, but the danger was. The cabin felt lighter when we stepped back inside. Grace closed the ledger and said, Well, I guess we won't be needing those contingency plans. Ruby smirked. Still keeping the shotgun under my bed, though. That night, Clarabelle sat beside me on the front steps. The stars were out, and for the first time since I arrived, the mountain felt like home. You sure about this? She asked. Still time to walk away. I looked out at the trees, the land, the firelight flickering behind us. I didn't come here looking for this, but I think Jeremiah knew what he was doing when he left me this place. She leaned her shoulder against mine. Maybe you can handle all 5 of us after all, she whispered. I smiled, still figuring that part out.
Morrison's trial didn't take place in our cabin, but it may as well have. The marshal returned 2 weeks later with a courier bag full of signed statements, letters from other women who'd fled Morrison's grasp, and legal orders freezing what was left of his land and assets. Turns out, the man who rode like a king had built his empire on lies and stolen labor. Clarabelle handed over the locket containing Margaret's sketch, along with a letter in her handwriting. Margaret refused to return in person, but her testimony, paired with the documents, carried enough weight to bury Morrison's case. Grace stood before the territorial magistrate, composed as ever, presenting every document with surgical precision. The judge reviewed them without blinking. His ruling was swift. Morrison was guilty of multiple counts of fraud, coercion, and unlawful confinement. He'd served no less than 20 years. But Morrison didn't go quietly. At sentencing, shackled and wild-eyed, he glared at us from across the courtroom. You think this ends with me, he hissed. There are men out there who think like I do. You just started something you can't finish. Clarabelle stepped forward, voice level but cold. "Then let 'em come. We'll be ready." It was the last time we ever saw Morrison. Back at the cabin, the weight finally lifted. The silence didn't feel tense anymore. It felt earned, like the land itself had exhaled. Sadie harvested the late summer squash with Violet, their hands caked in dirt, their laughter echoing through the field. Ruby took to riding long stretches again, her hair flying behind her like she'd never been chased. Grace began drawing up formal plans, a cooperative ownership structure, a ledger for future projects, even a brand name for the horses they'd start selling. Me? I chopped wood, a lot of it. It was simple work, honest, and gave me time to think. Clarabelle and I had a way of finding each other at sunset, on the porch, at the creek, by the barn, not speaking much, just being. One evening while she was oiling a saddle, I asked her, "You ever think about leaving, starting fresh somewhere else?" She looked at me like I'd grown two heads. "This is fresh. We built this life with our own hands. Leaving it would feel like tearing down everything we fought for." I didn't mean now. I meant before, when Morrison was breathing down your neck, when it wasn't safe. She stared at the saddle for a long time. Of course I thought about it, but I'd already run once. Jeremiah gave me a chance to stand still, to plant roots. She glanced at me then. "And now you have too." I nodded slowly. "Feels like I've been standing still my whole life. But this is different." She smiled, faint but real. That evening we had a quiet dinner, rabbit stew, cornbread, some peach preserves Violet had unearthed from the cellar. No ceremony, no speeches, just warmth, food, and 5 women who no longer looked over their shoulders. Afterward, Clarabelle asked me to walk with her to the far edge of the property. She showed me a stone marker, half buried beneath a patch of wildflowers. "Jeremiah's resting here," she said. "Didn't want a big grave, just this." I stood beside her in silence. "He'd be proud," I said, "of all of you, of what you've done." She looked down and back at me. "I think he'd be proud of you too." In that moment, I felt like the land, scarred but healing, hardened but still capable of something soft.
3 months passed like the blink of a tired eye. Summer turned to fall, and the land turned gold. The hills swayed with dried grasses, and the mornings came crisp, smelling of chimney smoke and sweet hay. The cabin, once Jeremiah's, then contested, now truly ours, stood like a testament to survival and reinvention. We expanded it together. Grace drew the plans, Ruby and I cut the lumber, Sadie handled the angles with the precision of a clockmaker. Violet painted the trim, whistling softly as she worked. Clarabelle oversaw the whole operation like a quiet foreman, only stepping in when a hand needed steadying or a back needed straightening. It wasn't just repairs, it was transformation. The cabin now had a second room, a loft, a proper wash house out back. We dug irrigation trenches, built a smokehouse, and fenced a larger pasture for the horses. One morning while we were splitting wood by the barn, Clarabelle tossed a kindling stick at my boots. "You still sure you can handle all 5 of us?" she asked, smirking. I leaned on the axe and looked at her, sweat running down my temple. "No," I said honestly, "but I've stopped trying." That got a laugh out of Ruby, who was leading a colt around the yard. Smart man. Inside, life found its rhythm. Sadie had taken a bacon. Quiet, strong Sadie, who once barely spoke, now turned out loaves of warm bread and flaky pies that had Violet sneaking slices before dinner. Grace began teaching herself bookkeeping from Jeremiah's old journals,
and Violet wrote poems in the margins when she thought no one was looking. Clarabelle, she still kept her distance in certain ways. Not cold, just watchful. But every evening she ended up beside me. Sometimes we'd talk about the land. Sometimes we'd sit in silence. Sometimes, when the stars were bright and the fire was low, we'd speak about things we never had before. Regrets, lost family, what it meant to feel safe. One evening, we sat on the edge of the porch, our legs dangling over, watching the sun bleed into the hills. "You came here wanting to be alone. Why'd you stay?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. Because I realized I wasn't empty, just untethered. And now, I looked at her. Now I've got something to hold on to. She didn't say anything, just slid her hand across the porch and rested it on mine. The next day we had visitors, not threats, but neighbors. A young couple from down the valley, curious about buying one of Ruby's horses. They walked the pasture, asked fair questions, and left with a handshake and a promise to return with payment. After they left, Violet ran barefoot across the yard, her dress flapping in the wind. "They said we heard about us all the way from Cold Hollow," she laughed. "Said we've got a reputation now." Clarabelle raised an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" "Depends who's talking," Violet grinned. We all laughed, and for the first time it wasn't laughter hiding fear. It was just joy, plain and unguarded. That night I stood by the creek where I'd first walked the land. Back then I'd come looking for quiet. Now I understood something deeper. I hadn't inherited solitude. I'd inherited the soil where something better could grow. And it was growing.
By the time winter rolled in, we weren't just surviving, we were thriving. The cabin had turned into a homestead, and the homestead into a name people started passing around. Folks from towns I'd never heard of came looking for horses, seeds, or simply advice on building a life after the storm. It felt like we were slowly stitching ourselves into the land's memory. Each woman had carved out her own space. Ruby managed the horses like she was born in the saddle. She named every foal, kept detailed notes, and taught Violet how to read a horse's mood just by the tilt of its ears. Sadie ran the garden with quiet brilliance. Rows of turnips, carrots, beans, and medicinal herbs I couldn't even pronounce. Grace took over the accounts, bartered with local merchants, and even negotiated a fair trade contract with a trading post 2 valleys over. Violet kept spirits high. She played guitar on slow mornings, left pressed flowers in our books, and once braided a crown of autumn leaves for Clarabelle, who wore it the whole day without a word. And Clarabelle, she remained the anchor. She didn't talk much about the past anymore. Didn't need to. It had been burned out of her gaze and replaced with something quieter, sturdier. She rode the fence line every morning before the frost could settle, checking every post, every rail. It wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. One morning, a letter arrived from the postman, a request for 6 trained horses from the governor's supply office. I read it twice. We're official now," I said, stunned. Clarabelle took the letter and smiled, faint and proud. "Told you we were worth betting on." Later that day, while we fed the animals and covered the last of the root cellar, Clarabelle looked over her shoulder and asked me something that caught me off guard. "You still sure about all this?" I turned from the trough. "All what?" "This," she said, gesturing around us. "The land, the chaos, the 5 women with too much past and not enough apology." I walked toward her and took off my gloves. You think I stayed because I was sure?" She didn't answer. "I stayed because every day I watched 5 people who'd been broken in different ways choose to rebuild instead of retreat. I watched you all fight for something better, and somewhere in the mess of all that, I found who I was supposed to be." Clarabelle's eyes searched mine like she was trying to find the lie in it, but there wasn't one. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. I opened it and saw Jeremiah's handwriting. "If Clayton shows up, tell him he didn't leave him this land for peace. He left it so he'd finally pick a side, make a life, find people worth fighting for." I folded it slowly, my chest tightening. "He always knew," I whispered. She nodded. "He just didn't know if you'd come." I took her hand then, not out of ceremony, but because it felt right. Because I finally understood what it meant to belong somewhere. Not because the deed said so, but because the people around you made it true. That night we had stew and cider, and Clarabelle leaned against my shoulder as the fire crackled low. The others laughed over a game of cards. Grace was beating them all. I looked around the room and thought, this is what legacy feels like. Not land, not power, people. We didn't just survive Morrison. We became something bigger because of him, because we chose to build instead of run, to trust instead of hide. We chose each other, and I wouldn't trade that for all the quiet in the world.